All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. You know we love a good thought experiment here, and today we're diving into some pretty radical ideas from a 19th century thinker named Lysander Spooner.
Oh, yeah. Spooner's fascinating stuff really gets you thinking.
His essay, Vices Are Not Crimes, really throws down the gauntlet, doesn't it? I mean, he's really pushing us to think about what the government should really be in charge of, right?
Absolutely. It challenges some really fundamental assumptions about right and wrong, and
Yeah.
especially about where we draw the line between personal choice and, the law.
Exactly. So at the heart of Spooner's argument is this distinction between a vice and a crime, which on the surface seems kind of straightforward.
Yeah, he defines a vice as basically anything that, well, primarily harms the person doing it, the individual. So think like, I don't know, gambling too much, drinking a little more than you should, or even just being, well, kind of lazy.
Right, those things might not be great for you, but are they really the government's business? Then you've got crimes, which Spooner sees as much more clear-cut actions that directly harm someone else.
Exactly. We're talking theft, assault, actually violating someone else's rights or safety or property. Those are the things Spooner thinks the government should be focused on.
That's where he gets really radical, though, because his stance is basically governments have no business punishing vices, like none at all.
Yeah, he's basically saying the government shouldn't be the morality police, right? Their job is to protect people from other people, not from themselves, essentially.
Which really makes you think, where do we draw the line then? If the government can't tell us we can't have that extra slice of cake or stay up too late reading, well, where does it end?
Right. That's exactly the slippery slope argument he makes. If the government can dictate what we do in our own homes, even if it only affects us, haven't we given them way too much power? Who gets to decide what's moral in that case?
That's a little unsettling when you really let it sink in, right? What if the government could fine us for not getting enough exercise or eating junk food?
It's easy to take those freedoms for granted, but Spooner would say that's exactly how tyranny starts small infringements that grow into bigger ones. And he makes a really compelling point about this whole idea of legislating morality. It's almost impossible to do fairly.
Right, because what one person considers a vice, another might think is perfectly fine. It all depends on context. Like having a glass of wine with dinner versus, polishing off the whole bottle yourself, totally different.
Exactly. And Spooner's point is, how can the government create a one-size-fits-all rule about that kind of thing that makes sense in every situation? It just doesn't work.
He really hits on that subjectivity of vice, doesn't he? And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because while Spooner's all about personal freedom, he also acknowledges that, well, vices can have some pretty bad consequences, right? Like addiction can lead to poverty.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from that at all. He's not saying vices are always harmless. But, and this is a key point, he argues that often it's not the vice that causes the problem, but the other way around.
So instead of being the root cause, the vice is more like a symptom.
Exactly. Think about it. Someone's stuck in a dead-end job, terrible pay, awful working conditions. Is it any surprise they might turn to, say, alcohol as a way to cope, even if it ultimately makes things harder?
It's like looking at the whole picture, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just judging the behavior, we need to understand the context, the underlying issues.
Absolutely. And that's a really crucial part of Spooner's philosophy, this idea that we should be addressing root causes, not just symptoms. And, it's not about condoning harmful behaviors, but it's about having a more nuanced, compassionate understanding of why people end up making those choices.
So if we're not throwing people in jail for vices, then what's the alternative? What does Spooner actually propose we do about it?
Well, he suggests a more proactive approach, right? Instead of just punishing people after the fact, he talks about prioritizing education, personal responsibility, helping people understand the consequences of their actions. It's about empowering individuals, not just punishing them.
So instead of just slapping on a Band-Aid after the damage is done, we're trying to prevent the damage in the first place.
Precisely. It's about giving people the tools and the knowledge they need to make better choices for themselves, which in the long run is going to be more effective than just reacting after something goes wrong.
Right. It's like the old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure or something like that.
Yeah.
But this doesn't mean ignoring the fact that, vices can have victims, right?
Yeah.
Even if the harm isn't always intentional.
Of course not. It's not about absolving people of responsibility for their actions. But Spooner's point is that there are more effective and more just ways of dealing with those situations than simply resorting to punishment.
It's about finding that balance, right, between individual liberty and the well-being of society as a whole. And honestly, that feels like a conversation we're still having today, more than 100 years later.
Absolutely. I mean, think about debates around drug legalization, freedom of speech, personal choices versus public health. These are all issues where Spooner's ideas about individual liberty and the role of government are just as relevant today as they were back then.
It's crazy how a thinker from another century can still feel so relevant, right? It's like he's speaking directly to the issues we're facing now.
And here's where it gets even wilder. Spooner wasn't just, an armchair philosopher. He actually lived by these principles, sometimes in really controversial ways. Like, he was a staunch abolitionist, totally against slavery, obviously, but he was also, get this, against the Civil War.
Really? That seems a little, well, counterintuitive given his stance on slavery.
Right. You'd think he'd be all for it. But Spooner saw it as a matter of principle. He believed that resorting to government force, even to right a horrific wrong like slavery, was ultimately a violation of individual liberty. He thought there should be other solutions, ones that didn't involve violence and coercion.
Wow, so he was really committed to his principles, even when it was, well, let's just say not a popular opinion. You got to admire that kind of consistency, even if you don't agree with everything he said.
Absolutely. He was a radical thinker, no doubt about it. And whether you agree with him or not, he definitely forces you to confront your assumptions about what freedom really means and what the role of government should be in our lives.
I mean, talk about a legacy, right? To have your ideas still sparking debate, like over a century later, that's pretty incredible.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show you the power of ideas, right? And I think the key takeaway from Spooner, for me at least, is that we should never just accept things the way they are. We got to be willing to question, to challenge, to think for ourselves.
Especially when it comes to something as fundamental as freedom, right? That's not something we can just take for granted. Spooner was really ringing that bell, even back then.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time in a lot of ways. But his ideas are more relevant now than ever, I think, because we're facing so many of the same questions about individual liberty, the role of government, where do we draw the line?
And the thing is, he doesn't give us all the answers.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like a how-to manual for freedom or anything.
Yeah.
But it gets you thinking, and that's what matters.
Exactly. It's about engaging with those tough questions, having those uncomfortable conversations, and being willing to really examine our own beliefs, Because, who knows, maybe we'll change our minds about something. Or maybe we'll come up with a whole new way of looking at the problem.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into vices are not crimes, I guess the question for our listeners is, what do you think? Where do you stand on this whole issue of personal freedom versus the role of government?
Yeah, it's a big one, and it's not an easy one either, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? The important thing is that we're having the conversation, that we're thinking critically about these issues, and that we're not afraid to challenge the status quo.
Because ultimately, freedom is something we have to actively protect, right? It's not just a given. We have to be willing to stand up for it, to fight for it, and to never stop questioning whether we're doing enough to preserve it. So keep those conversations going, folks. This has been a fascinating look at Lysander Spooner's Vices Are Not Crimes, and we hope it's given you plenty to chew on. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring those big ideas, and remember the most important discoveries are often the ones we make ourselves.